Welcome, everybody, to this next presentation in the series Community of Practice webinars. My name is Prasad Kadambi, and I am the past chair of the Risk-Informed Performance-Based Principles and Policy Committee, RP3C, we call it. Please mute whoever that is. ANS has been putting on these community of practice sessions for the past 3 years. Presentations and recordings of the events are available to the public at the ANS website under the tab RP3C. There are now over 40 such recordings available. The purpose of these webinars is to offer practitioners of concepts and methods related to risk-informed and performance-based approaches, RIPB we call it, a chance to share their knowledge and experience. I would expect that such practice is used for implementing nuclear technology and also to evaluate its safety. The purpose of RP3C is to help modernize ANS standards. The Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act, NEMA 2019, associated modernization with application of RIPB approaches. Congress reiterated and reinforced the idea of using RIPB to achieve effective regulation and oversight of nuclear technology as recently as 2024 in the Advanced Act. There's growing realization within the nuclear community that conventional, prescriptive, and deterministic approaches are not going to support increasing use of nuclear technology to play its rightful role for the benefit of society. Socializing alternative approaches could drive changes in industry and regulatory practices. ANS offers the COP files on its website to serve as a knowledge repository of the experience from a wide range of practitioners in the field. We hope that more people will use this knowledge base to speed up needed changes in the state of the art as well as the state of practice. These events are generally scheduled for the last Friday of a month. Today we will hear from Eric Thornsbury of EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute. Eric will introduce himself and the subject of his talk. Eric, please go ahead.
All right, thank you very much, Prasad. I'll be talking today about some research that EPRI is doing and has just completed on risk metrics for advanced reactors. I am Eric Thornsbury. I started my career actually with the NRC, where I was first in the Office of Research and then on the local staff for the ACRS, supporting them for the last few years. I was at NRC. Then I was in consulting business with Aaron Engineering and Jensen Hughes, where I owned PRA models for several sites, did various other international and domestic training on things like level 2 PRA, and worked for EPRI a little bit as a contractor. And now for the last few years, I've been here at EPRI. And one of my main roles is to lead our research in risk analysis methods and tools for advanced reactors. So I'm actually, it's interesting because I officially in the Risk and Safety Management Group, the RSM group that does all the stuff for the current fleet, but I'm matrixed over to the Advanced Nuclear Technology team, the ANT group. So I get some fun from both groups and some work from both. I do want to start with an overview of industry activities in this area of advanced reactors. EPRI and NEI had worked together to develop a roadmap for North America to facilitate the development and deployment of advanced reactors. That roadmap is broken into 3 pillars, these 3 on the top, and then within that, there are 13 strategic elements that it breaks down into to identify some of the challenges or enablers that we need as an industry in order to help the next generation of plants come online. So you'll see various things in here. What you won't specifically see in this table is something that says you should build a better PRA model, or you should do risk analysis methods and tools, which is the focus of my work and some of our work at EPRI. But we know from experience that a lot of these areas are touched by risk-informed approaches. So everything from initial licensing, even in environmental concerns, into plant and component design, it touches into operation and maintenance later on. So having the risk analysis methods and tools for the advanced reactor designs is going to be an important enabler to help bring them into being and online. So from that, EPRI has started a research program to look at these risk analysis methods and tools for advanced reactors. We're starting from a good place with the current fleet, where we have a lot of risk-informed applications and a lot of underlying infrastructure and methods and tools. So we want to see how ready all of those methods and tools are to support this next generation of reactors. So we've developed a research plan along with that, and we've started executing that specifically in that area. But we've noticed that there's some related areas within advanced nuclear technology where the risk approach is necessary. So we're coordinating on those areas, things that we see here, such as the reliability and integrity management, work for setting up new plans for monitoring and examination of structures in the plant for materials purposes. We're operating with some DOE projects on new advanced reactor designs, looking at some of the safety and risk analysis related to those. EPRI has also developed this technical methodology on separating the nuclear facility from a licensing perspective from the adjacent facilities that are around it. So that has an aspect of risk-informed approaches within that. So that initial research plan that we developed is documented here. This is almost a year and a half old now. So this highlights those many areas where we identified some potential needs for improved or new methods and tools for risk. It identified those with the highest priority that are short-term and very important needs. But we continue to monitor and reprioritize that as we go. So on our, as we finish one project and we look to see what's next, and as we plan 1 or 2 or 3 years in advance, we're using this as a tool to get more input from the industry and see what else we need so that we can reprioritize. This website shown here on the right is just a simple wiki page where it talks about what we've done within this program as EPRI, what we're doing right now, any recent products that have been produced, and then as we do new things, we'll update that probably like twice a year or so to give everybody a public-facing page of the activities that we're engaging in. So one of the first things that we started to look at, one of those highest priority items, was risk metrics for advanced reactors. And so we wanted to set our objectives such that we're looking at the range of options available for advanced reactors. There's some things that already exist. We want to capture those and look at those, but we also want to see if there's any gaps that we could help fill in. Once we've identified those options, we're assessing where they're good and where they're bad, and then hopefully the goal was to get to a common approach for these reactor risk metric calculations so that we can support the risk-informed decision making in all of those elements, from licensing into construction into operation. So the key questions that we started with are, we have good risk metrics for the current fleet that work well, the CDF and LRF or LRF for our light water reactors. They're really good for what they do. When we try to apply them to advanced reactors, where might they work well? Where are their weaknesses? So there's going to be pluses and minuses with both of those options. The other piece is when we look to the fullest, I guess, risk metrics, something that goes all the way to the off-site impacts at the end of a level 3 PRA. And those quantitative health objectives, for example, from the NRC, those are based on those kinds of metrics for early fatalities and latent cancers. And so those are also good for some things. So where are their strengths and where are their weaknesses when it comes to all the risk-informed decisions that we need to make for our new reactors? And so we've kind of got the two extremes. We've got what we had, and then the most complete form of a metric in something like the QHOs. But so there's that gap in the middle of, for the advanced reactor designs where the CDF and LRF don't work well, what are the other options and how can they work? Do we have to go all the way to the early fatalities and latent cancer risks, or is there something else that we can use? To address that, of course, you start with some background research, understanding the development of those high-level safety objectives such as the US QHOs, but we're also looking internationally too to see what the IAEA does, what other nations do, because we want this to have a global perspective. So we have these current metrics like CDF and LRF and LRF, but they have underlying assumptions in them, especially where it comes to how those connect up to those higher level safety objectives. And a lot of those assumptions are going to be based on light water reactors. So we want to understand those to make sure that, as we think about other types of plants or smaller versions of light water reactors, we accommodate those assumptions and adjust them where we need to. So as I mentioned, the figures here, one's from IAEA, one's from NEA. So, we captured a worldwide view of history on these metrics. So looking at all that brought us to essentially 3 or 4 options for what we could do. We could try to do something very analogous to CDF and the level 2 metrics. Could we just tweak them a little bit and adapt them for new types of plants? So that was one option. It has strengths and weaknesses. We could, as EPRI, try to go off and develop new design-specific metrics, but with such a wide range of new plant designs, that is not the easiest thing, and you really need some of that detailed information. But we understand that that's needed in some areas. So that, again, has strengths and weaknesses. Another option was to try to develop something technology neutral. We recognize that those end of level 3 metrics are pretty technology neutral, but would there be something else that would fit in there? So those are kind of the 3 options, but we bounce those against the existing options throughout various documents and approaches, but including like in the Licensing Modernization Project, LMP, which is in NEI 1804. That uses those health effect metrics of early fatality risk and cancer risk as a cumulative metric that can work, and it certainly does. But we also recognize that those are not the easiest to calculate. Some of the uncertainties start to compound. They can be site-specific issues that come in there. And then there's also a metric in NEI 1804 that's a more frequent sort of normal or expected occurrences, where the goal is to have those less than 1 per year. So that's a frequent, low consequence impact. PRA usually looks at the less frequent, high consequence impacts. And so as we develop these options, we decided to focus on this third one, trying to focus on something technology neutral that would work for everybody, but recognizing that we have to also have some guidance on how to stretch back to design-specific types of metrics. So along those lines, we identified 3 key characteristics that we thought this starting point should have. We thought it should focus on public safety. We can certainly use risk stuff for other reasons other than regulatory and public safety. You can use it for commercial risk and operability and capacity factors and things like that. But we wanted to focus this one on public safety because that's what touches the licensing. It drives a lot of the decision making in the current fleet, for maintenance practices and other decisions, and changes to the plant have to go through that process of checking the safety-related risk metrics and following the current regulations. So we felt that was one of the key characteristics. We wanted to be technology neutral, so it applied to new plants, whether they're light water or non-light water reactors. And in theory, they would even apply to existing plants, but they've kind of got a good thing going already. And we wanted it to be international, not be tied directly to one nation's regulatory approach or regime, but we want it to be able to support global deployment, because a lot of the new designers are looking globally. And so we don't want to have to develop something that works in one place but doesn't work in another place. Now, clearly, when you get to different nations, depending on where you are, there's always going to be things you have to deal with. But from a starting point, we wanted to try to be as neutral as we could in all three of these areas. So from that leads us to focus on a primary safety metric and the development of guidance to select that primary metric for your plant. And with that focus on public safety, we started to home in on the idea that it should probably be something based on release or dose. Things that cause damage to the plant are serious and they're a problem. But if we want to focus on public safety, we want to get to the point where we're analyzing releases off-site, some sort of release that can lead to some sort of a dose or an impact off-site. So that's kind of where we start. But then we realize that that's not in and of itself going to answer all the questions and provide all the insights, all the risk insights that we're going to need. So we sort of move to the left and say, okay, well, before a release of radioactive material leaves the site, we want to have something that gives us clues to problems before that. So we call that a preventive safety metric. And so when you start to move to the left in this area, you do start to get more design specific, because different designs are going to have different accident sequences that lead to that release. And so you therefore have to take more of those plant-specific designs into account. So the goal in this left branch is to provide guidance for some common principles for identifying those metrics that work. The core concept, it comes down to like a loss of control of radioactive materials. If it's a ceramic fuel pellet, when that pellet starts to melt, our traditional core damage frequency sort of approach, you're losing control of the fuel. It's losing its geometry, and it's starting to get out into the reactor coolant system. If it's a TRISO fuel and it's circulating through the reactor and through fuel handling and other places, as long as it's under control, you've got it. Or even in a molten fuel situation, you still have it contained, you know where it's supposed to be, and as long as that's okay, you're good. But as soon as something happens to cause a loss of control, that's kind of where you start to create an accident scenario. So that loss of control of materials is kind of the core idea here for the preventive metric. But then from that center point, we also recognize that we still have to understand those high-level safety objectives on the right. So whatever we develop in the center that's kind of a surrogate, in a way, it should be consistent with those high-level safety objectives, like the QHOs or whatever regulatory environment you're in. So when you make that jump from a release or a dose up to that high-level safety objective, that's where you get into the assumptions related to level 3 PRA. And, we do so that, it's modeled, there are good tools out there, but there's assumptions. And a lot of what we're used to dealing with light water reactors may not apply when we go to different places. So let's understand those assumptions and provide some guidance on how to demonstrate that consistency for different plant designs. And we're doing good on time. So we kind of broke this down into 3 components. The first is, what consequence are we really going to home in on? So we decided to recommend a dose-based approach. We looked at the traditional, like, large early release sorts approach. Okay, well, what's large and what's early? Well, large is going to be different depending on the plant and the core inventory And even if we tried to define it, it might be challenging. And early is tied to some dependencies on assumed offsite actions, and it's going to impact other aspects of it. And there's just so much variability and uncertainty there when you go to different plant designs. It didn't really make sense as something to try to adopt for everybody. We thought about activity of release. Some environments do that. It's a number of terabecquerels of a certain radioisotope. And, how as the metric or as the consequence that they're measuring with a metric. And so that does work in some ways, but again, as you get to different reactor fuel types, that can be challenging. And is there just one that matters? Well, no, there's a whole suite of radionuclides that can matter. And so can you pick one? Can you do a surrogate? Can you somehow mathematically combine different ones? There's some questions there and assumptions related to offsite impacts that made that a little more challenging. Still useful and still useful for specific purposes, just like large early release can be useful for specific purposes, but didn't really seem to fit the target that we were aiming at. So we landed on dose. Again, it's independent from the reactor design. Regardless of where the stuff starts, if it gets off site and impacts a member of the public, dose would be a good measure from that, independent of the design. It also kind of provides that off-site impact measure that we were looking for. We wanted to make that difference from on-site to off-site impacts. And we already are used to dealing with those. We don't often do it as much in the PRA world, but lots of other regulations and other planning documents, they all are used to using this, so we can adopt it. The NEI 1804 is a frequency consequence curve with a dose criterion on there, or different dose criteria. So we can kind of used to that in the nuclear world. We can adopt that into our PRAs, we think, pretty readily. Second component, once we have the consequence, now we have to figure out what metric to use. So we return to our characteristic of focusing on the public safety. We want to limit the need for off-site response to protect the public. If there's something that happens at a facility and there's no impact on the public, that's good. That's our goal. That's what's almost always going to be. If there needs to be some sort of off-site response to protect the public, then that's a concern. So actions need to be taken. So one metric that we can start to look at is, well, at what point do those off-site responses start to kick in? So again, we looked around the world. We looked at IAEA, protect PAGs in the United States, the protective action guides. They all tend to range in this, 20 to 50 sort of millisievert. Some go up to about 100 before some actions happen. Some start to look lower, but in general, we're talking in this range of predicted dose to take action over. And then there's also a timing piece in it. If it's going to be really quick or a very slow building, it depends, and the actions can vary, but we're usually talking about something in that range around the world. The distance for the dose matters. So again, if we're trying to focus on protection of the public to use this metric, we want to set at the boundary. Wherever that public can be, we want to measure our dose at that point. So our recommendation comes out to, in general, say we want a metric that is defined as a specific dose at the boundary for a set amount of time. And of course, so there's three variables in there. What's the dose, what's the boundary, and what's the time? A dose of 50 millisieverts or 55 rem generally encompasses most of the definitions for necessary offsite action. Some might be a little sooner, some might be a little later, but that's a pretty good sort of expected value as you look around the world. And we recognize that different places may have to tweak that number a little bit, and that's fine. We're not so married to the number as we are to the concept of creating a metric based on a dose at a boundary for a time. So as those first two pieces come together now, they sort of indicate that we want a risk metric for exceeding a defined level of dose, like 50 millisieverts, because anything below that would have really insignificant offsite impacts. It's kind of a nobody cares. I mean, they do because impacts on the plant, but from a public safety perspective, it should have minimal impact. And we can calculate a metric like this around that end of a level 2 PRA, just starting to pull into that early level 3 PRA model. So we're used to like release categories at the end of level 2. We don't usually quite calculate a dose there. But as you get into the early level 3, we know we can kind of do that. And so we could end up, we would promote this as, doing it like we do level 2 sort of for LERF, but now we want the sum of the sequence that exceed this dose limit. And even if necessary, if you had uncertainties or ones that were close, you could even take fractional contributions. Here's an accident sequence with a certain frequency, and 40% of the time we think it would exceed the limit, and 60% of the time it wouldn't. Okay, that's kind of like another branch on the tree. We can accommodate those. So this kind of fits into our existing PRA infrastructure in the way we calculate things. We worked on a target value. So what should be the limit? We talk about CDF limits of 10 to the minus 4, 10 to the minus 5, and 10 to the minus 6 for some of the level 2 ones. There's lots of targets out there. This one doesn't immediately call for a universal target because different plant designs might actually be okay with different target values based on their maximum release or not. A plant whose maximum is 60 millisieverts could have a different target than one whose maximum is 6,000, just because that link from this metric up to the QHOs is going to be different for those two plants. So while we're promoting this new metric in the way to calculate it, we're not necessarily setting a target. And that's really more of a regulatory function anyway, so we're not going there with this report. But the idea is that if you're below whatever target is set, then everything is good. All the assumptions that build up to the QHOs or whatever high-level safety objectives you're at are going to be good. So that gets us to how we define this metric. So again, we were talking about calculating off-site dose to avoid an emergency action. So we came up with ODEF. We'll see if that catches on or not, but we call it the off-site dose emergency action frequency. We would use our best estimate, consequence estimates, just like we already do for level 2 PRA and into level 3 PRA. Best estimate, again, based on commonly used PRA approaches. We don't want to be unnecessarily conservative. We recognize there's going to be variations, again, in the number. There may even be variations in how you do the dose calculations in different regulatory environments. That's fine. It all still works with this approach. And just like we do in PRA, when you get to the end of an event tree and you need to assign an end state, a lot of the branches you can do simply. They're clearly core damage or they're clearly not. In this case, we would say there's probably many, many branches that are clearly not going to be an OD, an offsite dose, require an emergency action. And there are probably going to be some that are. And so those would get categorized appropriately. And then where you need to, you refine the calculations, just like we already do in PRA. So this fits into the environment we're used to working in. That other variable about the boundary, well, that can, again, be defined by the licensee and or the regulator in concert with the regulator. Some regulatory environments use site boundary, some use exclusion area boundary. That's fine. The point is you have to define it at a certain point, and we can work with that. And this also should work for all hazards and all sources. This isn't saying you have to do a PRA for all hazards and all sources, but whatever ones you do, this should accommodate it. So it will certainly work for reactor cores. It should also work for other sources if you have to deal with fuel handling machines or spent fuel pools or whatever else. Those, if they release radioactive materials, lead to a dose, those will fit into this metric nicely. The other niche this kind of fills is, as I mentioned, like in NEI 1804, they have a metric for very frequent events, low consequence, high frequency events, and then they have the sort of QHO related metrics of latent and early fatality risks at the very end of a level 3 PRA, but those are a little more difficult to calculate. So this is trying to fill that niche in between to provide a surrogate, but it still meets that PRA purpose that we focus on, which is the low frequency, high consequence realm of events or accident sequences. And again, this draws the line between licensing and regulatory authority. Sequences that don't trip this should stay in licensing authority. Those that do get the regulatory authority, and that's where that line gets drawn for action. So the other two things that I'll close up with, and I won't go through these in detail, is just that left-hand box and that right-hand box on our initial figure. The idea that we can provide guidance to develop those preventive metrics that might be more unique to a design. That allows actions and issues to be identified early before you actually get to radioactive release or accident sequences that go there. So some guidance there, some points to some tools in IAEA and other places that help you analyze and break down this concept here on the right, sort of a waterfall of you start with the data, identify your critical functions, identify the barriers that exist. It's all stuff we already do in nuclear plant design, but trying to fit that then into, marry that with the PRA model and make sure that whatever metrics you define here are still consistent with our primary one that we've talked about for most of this time. So the report includes some guidance on selecting those, and then it also provides the right-hand side of making sure that when you have your ODIF or whatever variation of that you use, that it is still justified to use with whatever target values you select so that you still meet those high-level objectives that incorporate those level 3 PRA details that will need to be developed to justify it. So it walks you through the sorts of things that you need to define in order to show that consistency. So that brings us back around to where we started with this figure. Again, we've created this sort of recommended approach to this primary safety metric, and while we put out one recommended level, that 50 millisieverts, there's nothing that says, one, that can't be changed a little bit, or that you might even have multiple values. In current PRA where you do large and small, sometimes you could set up a higher one and a lower one if you needed different targets. But this sort of approach, every plant design should be able to use so that we can develop some consistency in how we talk about risk with the new sites. And then it provides that left-hand and right-hand side, sort of like a level 1 and a level 2 and a level 3 PRA, but with a lot of the new designs, those distinctions don't work quite as well. So we're not calling it 1, 2, 3. We're just trying to fit those different concepts into the risk metrics. Excuse me. So there's the report. It is an EPRI report, so it comes with all the strings attached to that. And now we're talking with NRC and other regulators and other stakeholders, trying to see what we can do with this. NEI is planning on, if I can speak for them a little bit, I think they're planning on trying to use this and build on a little more from a regulatory perspective to start to set up and test some of these ideas going to the left and or to the right. So we're interested in interacting with people who want to test it out and try it and throw stones at it, whatever you want, to try to help us move together as an industry. Yeah, so that's the end of my slides. I see a few things going through the chat, but I didn't catch them necessarily as I went. But
so, Eric,
into questions and discussion.
I think the first one, this EPRI's work
Can't quite make you out, Brandon.
Brandon, you're hard to, you're breaking up a lot.
All right, so it looks like we had some issues there. Now let's see, I saw...
Let me just try to navigate through this question process while Brandon is trying to get his audio fixed. Let's see, there are a couple of questions in the chat. The first one is, what tool does IAEA use for the level 3 PRA? Do you know, Eric?
If you mean tools like software, like Macs, I don't. Yeah, or if it's
I
more
mean,
tools more broadly. I
well,
think a
okay.
lot of that is, a lot of that's regulator dependent in terms of where they set their high level safety objectives. I do think IAE has some guidance on that, but I don't know the details there enough to answer, I think.
Okay. The next question in the chat is, how is this being shaped by the current political landscape in the US?
Well, it's interesting, and a related question that comes up is, how's this fitting into Part 53 in the U.S.? And this started independent of all that stuff. This was coming more out of, PRA modelers and the technical community saying, we need to develop a more consistent way to measure our end states, to identify our end states for these new plants. So we're approaching this from a very technical approach, so we're not worried about what Part 53 looked like last year or looks like this week or is going to look like when it's done. And we're not really focused on what the political landscape is working at. We're just looking at it more from a purely technical perspective. So my answer would be it's not impacting it at all. I don't think. We're just looking at it as engineers.
Okay, and I see that Andrew Sauder has responded to another question in the chat, but we have Steve Nesbitt with his hand raised. So, Steve, go ahead.
Hello, Steve.
Hey, Eric. Very interesting presentation. I'm trying to I've got Part 53 on my mind because today is the deadline for comments.
Yeah.
So, and I've got comprehensive risk metrics on my mind,
Yeah.
so I'm trying to figure out how all this work fits in. So just to kind of repeat back a little bit of what you said and tell me if I go astray. In this methodology, you would basically establish some kind of dose level based probably on emergency action levels and calculate a frequency for exceeding that using something between a level 2 and level 3 PRA, basically. And what that tells you is, and I'm trying to bridge this back to safety goals, and maybe I shouldn't be, but in terms of prompt fatalities, that risk number you get would certainly bound, prompt fatality risks because at 5 rem, you're not going to have any prompt fatalities. So, you may have some at lower risk, but that doesn't really tell you anything about that. And it doesn't really say that much about latent fatalities either, I don't think. I mean, because that's sort of the integrated dose to the population basis, which is instead of just a dose number at a particular point. So what I'm inferring from that is there really wasn't, you guys aren't really trying to tie this back to safety goals per se, kind of unlike QHOs, which do tie back there. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, with the additional comment that we didn't try to make that tie, but we tried to provide some guidance on how you would make that tie for your plant. So because those plant details on what those accident sequences really look like help justify that tie to be able to say, yes, I meet the QHOs or I meet whatever other high-level objective there is, does depend on those details. We kind of tried to unravel the way that CDF and LERF do that, and the answer wasn't as clear as we would have hoped historically. But we tried to kind of pull that apart and lay it out in a way that somebody could recreate that sort of process for a different kind of plant so that you can still show that. So then when you do go to the regulator like the NRC with your cumulative risk metric that you propose and you say, I'm going to use this, if you use ODEF, for example, and this is why it's consistent with the QHOs or the other high-level ones, because I've done this other calculation that shows, yes, here's my frequency, But even with that level of those accident sequences, I still meet these with margin, and with plenty of comfort there. So we don't answer it, but we try to help you answer the question.
Okay, well, thanks. Just a quick follow-up, maybe.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to look at the advantage of this compared to doing a full level 3 and just comparing directly to QHOs. And I guess the answer to that is that you don't have to do the full level 3 and all that's implicit in that. You
Yeah.
can do a simpler calculation to get to your answer.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really the core. Trying to, that's the same way we use the surrogates today of CDF and LARF, trying to find that sweet spot of it has enough to it without doing some of the other, longer, more difficult work and compounding those uncertainties. So.
Right. Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you, Eric. I guess next question is from Don Doobie. I didn't recognize his name at first, but Don had a question on the chat as well as now that I see him on the. But go ahead, Don. You can pose the question in the chat.
Yeah.
Any other question?
Sorry about the Pepe part. That's French Canadian for grandfather. Now that I'm retired. Eric, good seeing you again. On the dose calculation, are you just basically putting a person at the closest boundary at the center line of the plume for 4 days? No rain, no meteorological sampling. It's just that kind of a simple calculation.
Yeah, so we don't get into those details too directly. We mention those various questions and say, these are the things you have to know. And a lot of that becomes regulator dependent. They say you must do it this way. And if they don't, then you would say, this is how I'm doing it. So it's that balance of trying not to be conservative. All those things you mentioned, closest point, center line, nothing to wash it out, could be considered conservative. But in general, we should do it the same way we're doing it for LMP or other things like that. We don't get into those technical details, but we acknowledge that you need to know what you're, required to do, and you need to adopt what current practice is wherever you are. Not a perfect answer for you.
It's okay, thanks.
Thank you. Brandon, you have your hand up. I hope you're coming through on a different audio, is it?
Is this audio better?
Yeah, yes, it is. Much.
Okay. All right, great. So I appreciate you stepping in and handling that. It looks like also in the chat we got the question answered about, EPRI's use of units. And in this case, it is the sieverts for the SI. I guess, Eric, I do have a question for you here in terms of OD. So one of the things that I know that the current fleet uses things like CDF and LRF4 is relative risk metrics in certain applications like Delta CDF or Delta LRF. In the report or in the work leading up to it was the use and the application of relative risk metrics like, something like Delta OD. Was that something that was considered? And if so, do you have any thoughts on kind of the benefits or potential challenges there?
Yeah, certainly. So it's not explicitly there, but our focus was creating a metric or recommending a metric that would work in ways we're used to working with. So this could certainly be used to do delta risk calculations and or absolute sort of risk calculation. So we know that that's a discussion that's happening in the industry and with the PRA standards and things about use of relative risk, where it's useful, where it's not. The idea with this is if it gets adopted and gets used, you could certainly use it. You could certainly do relative risk stuff if necessary. But again, I think there's a different technical question and policy question that goes with that, which is, when you get to low enough levels, what does it matter? maybe the absolute's more important than the relative. So the metric should work like we're used to with other metrics, so it can do that. So it's not exclusive to one way or the other.
Okay, yeah, and then that's good. And I guess one other note here in the chat is Steve notes that it appears that the two reference EPRI reports are available to EPRI members only. Is that intended to continue as such, or will these reports eventually be accessible to the general public?
So the new one on the risk metrics specifically, that one I know is still in membership mode. The one at the beginning of the presentation should be publicly freely available. Of course, they're all public if you want to pay for them, but freely available. That was like around slide 3. That one here should be free to everybody, as should be the wiki site. But let me know if they're not, and I can point you to a better place perhaps.
But I see that Andrew Sauder has his hand up. Maybe he's going to address that.
And so then, and the other thing I was going to add, and then I'll get Andrew in, is eventually most of our reports do cycle into a freely public mode eventually. So that it should get there, but again, the value for our members makes some of them stay under that. Andrew, did I get that right?
Yeah, I mean, that was what I was going to state was we do have a policy at every 5 years. We review even, price documents, and the intent is to make as much available for free as soon as possible, but some things do have to be licensed or continue to be priced to protect our members' investment. But these things can also be up for debate and be informed by even, let's say, our members. So, yeah.
Well, and like in this example, we're talking about some of this stuff publicly. So the concepts are kind of out there. You may not be able to get into the report and see all the details, but, you're getting the idea of where you could go as a PRA modeler with it.
The other thing is, not to get too much into the EPRI drama and details and dirty laundry, but, for example, when our members contract with people, through their contract, they can gain access to these things for direct use for our members. So there are many ways to get access if they're needed, especially to support utilities.
So, one other question for you, Eric. As you look at moving forward with the ODEEF concept, is there any conversation ongoing or any thoughts about some sort of kind of pilot or case study?
A little bit. We're certainly open to that. And as I mentioned, NEI, if I understand right, the last time I talked to my contact there was, they're planning on trying to do that sort of thing, using some plant-specific information to try to see how this applies and providing feedback for us. So yeah, I hope so. And if anybody else wants to, let me know, and we'll be happy to try to help you.
I don't see any other questions, Eric, but let me ask, are you going to be submitting this report for review to NRC?
We don't have that planned right now. We have talked with them about it. And so they're aware of it. And we were at both public meetings and just, in research MOU type meetings, they're aware of it. So it's not really in a form that would be something that they would review and approve, like a topical report. So I don't think there's an advantage to that right now. But like you mentioned, the part 53 that says, bring your own cumulative risk metric. And so if people wanted to use our approach and bring it with that report, it would kind of get implicitly reviewed during that process.
Well, if you're bringing into consideration Part 53, I would make a distinction over there, because the highest level safety objective in Part 53 is just retention of radioactive material. So in a sense, it is, you might say that, at least my interpretation of Part 53 is that that represents entirely the prevention concept that you talk about. And so, it doesn't even go to anything beyond that. I guess
Yeah.
the way I would see it in relation to your work is that it doesn't go beyond the prevention part in this picture that you have on with the yellow, green, and the blue sort of.
Yeah. Well, I think that's fair, and I think my advice would be, if you're trying to develop that preventive metric piece, you should still follow this and go to that center point and then work your way back, rather than trying to build it starting at the left or starting in your PRA. So yeah, we hope that helps people do that who could use that guidance.
Well, on the other hand, you don't even need a PRA if you're going to just focus on the performance objective of retention of radioactive materials. So,
yeah, and this, by setting targets like this too, the idea that some plants could have a 0 is conceivable if they can't release enough to trip this metric. And yeah, if they focus, you certainly don't have to do a risk-informed approach, but if you do and you need a risk metric, we hope this helps.
Yeah, I think that is so, Brandon, you say there are many other questions. Go ahead, please. Oh,
So yeah, I don't see anything else. So unless anybody raises their hand here at the last minute, I think you can probably wrap things up.